All right, let's start. So this is the session Biosemiotics, and as I announced before the break, the order of papers is changed, and that's to accommodate bonfire in a village in the UK, which might cause noise issues. And that's why Amelia Lewis will go first. Then Kalevi Küll will follow 6:30, and lastly, I will present myself at 7 o'clock. Amelia Lewis is a zoologist. She has 2 master degrees in animal behavior and a vivid interest in theoretical biology. So we'll hear some of that in this talk, which is called In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception, Possible Links Between the Vibrational Theory of Olfaction and the Evolution of Language. So please start sharing your screen or presentation.
There we go. Right, there we go. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. Yes, the paper is titled In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception, Possible Links Between the Vibrational Theory of Olfaction and the Evolution of Language. Oh dear. It's not moving my slides. Yeah, I got a bit of a problem with my, oh, there we go. It's done it. So the presentation is a series of testable hypotheses looking at the physiological mechanisms underpinning sensory perception and the possible relationship to vocal communication in animals and possibly language evolution in humans. An idea or concept known as frequency mimicking. And I actually have an anonymous reviewer from the journal Biosemiotics to thank for that terminology. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any empirical data to present with the hypotheses, but I do have the theory surrounding it and supporting evidence from the literature. So to start, this is really the phenomenon that underpins the hypotheses. And I'll give a brief overview, and I say a brief overview because cross-modal sensory perception is a really diverse and complex field. But in brief, I'm talking about an interaction between 2 or more sensory modalities during sensory perception. As I say, there's a lot of work, particularly in humans, which I guess is understandable because we can report directly on our subjective sensory experiences. And most of the work tends to focus on what we would, I guess, perceive as the main senses, particularly vision, taste, hearing, and smell. I haven't really found anything in the scientific literature on proprioception, although there's been some really interesting talks at the conference on dance, for example. There's nothing on magnetoreception either that I could find. And whilst magnetoreception is not something humans really think about, it is very important for a lot of animal species. For example, these Canada geese at the bottom, they rely on the Earth's magnetic field to be able to navigate tens of thousands of miles across the globe when there aren't really any other cues, for example, when they're above the ocean. As I say, I haven't come across anything in the scientific literature looking at cross-modal perception with magnetoreception, but there is information on multimodal sensory apparatus. So for example, in birds, and a lot of the studies are on chickens and robins, I don't know why, but there have been a few studies showing that the birds can actually see the Earth's magnetic field. And to do it, they use the cones that are involved in EM vision. And it's particularly the cones that they use to see the ultraviolet end of the spectrum, so very short wavelengths. There is experimental evidence to demonstrate that cross-modal perception is found across species. So there are, as I've said, there's studies in humans. There are also studies on domestic animals, for example, dogs, horses, and goats are the ones that spring to mind. But there are also studies on wild animals. So for example, this study on a reptile species, this is a Nile crocodile, and studies on insects, for example, this species on tropical butterflies. These two on the wild animals, they're interesting. They're on foraging behavior and gustatory consummatory behavior. And what both of the studies found is that the visual cues had to match the chemical cues before the animals engaged in gustatory behavior, so before they ate anything. There are also studies in humans that show the parameters of intensity in one modality directly affect the perception of the intensity of another. And a really good study is this one by Zellner and Kautz, which looks at colour hue and odour intensity. So they presented participants with colour samples of differing hues, followed by an odour sample, and they found that the intensity of the colour affected the perception of the odour sample. There's also the McGurk effect, which is an interaction between hearing and vision. This affects our interpretation of speech in humans. So if you show human participants an audio-visual clip where they're seeing someone pronounce, for example, the letter V, but what they hear is the letter F, they will actually interpret the auditory perception as being a V, which kind of suggests that the visual channel has quite a heavy influence on the auditory channel. There's also synesthesia, where one sensory modality stimulates another. I'm a colour grapheme synesthete, so this at the bottom is how I perceive the alphabet. And it's not learned, it's not associative learning, it's just a naturally, spontaneously occurring phenomenon. Another interesting phenomenon is affective colour perception. So for example, we tend to associate certain colours with specific emotions. Love is often associated with red or pinks, as interestingly is anger. There are expressions such as green with envy, feeling blue, and yellow bellied, which means cowardly or fearful. And while some of these are cultural, a lot of them, for example, love and anger, are cross-cultural. So again, this demonstrates it's not a learned phenomenon, it is a spontaneously occurring phenomenon. So I thought about possible explanations as to what explains all this. And one hypothesis is that all sensory modalities operate as mechanoreception processes, but at differing levels of sensitivity. At the moment, the scientific consensus is, well, we know that hearing and touch, for example, are vibrational. Colour vision, it's not really known. We know about cones, but not what the underlying mechanism is. There's no real consensus. Olfaction, the generally accepted consensus is the lock and key mechanism of olfaction, which is where it's the shape of odour molecules, which is detected on nerves in the olfactory epithelium. And that's what gives specific odours their own unique smell. However, there is an alternative hypothesis. It's slightly controversial. It has its opponents and proponents, but it's called the vibrational theory of olfaction. And this is where odours are detected and perceived via the vibration of the molecular bonds in odour molecules. And the underlying mechanism is that of electron tunneling, where electrons behave as waves as well as particles, and the waveform can actually form on the other side of a barrier. I won't go into too much detail of the quantum physics behind that, but somebody who is working, a biophysicist who is working in that field is Dr. Luca Turin. And he does an absolutely fascinating TED talk where he presents his work. It's called The Science of Scent, and he can give far more information on the underlying mechanisms if anyone's interested. But what really fascinated me about his talk is that he actually plays the odor frequencies, the frequencies of the molecular bonds on a keyboard so you can hear them. And that made me ask the question, is there a possible relevance of this to animal communication and human language? Certainly many species, including some songbirds, for example, the European starling and minor birds, as well as mammalian species, seals, dolphins, and elephants are known to use vocal mimicry, and they can even mimic human speech. There's also evidence of more complex information and grammatical and linguistic elements being present in some animal communications. And an interesting recent study is this one by Favaro et al. It's on African penguins. And they found that the vocalizations of these animals do conform to some linguistic laws. So again, I asked the question, could animals be using vocal communication to mimic electromagnetic, molecular, and acoustic frequencies that they've detected in the environment by reproducing them as vocalizations or frequency mimicking, similar to how leukotriene is able to reproduce the odor molecule vibrations as sound? And if this is true, it would give rise to more complex referential vocal communications beyond simple vocal expressions of emotion. And just out of interest regarding the cognition of animals, the parrot down on the left, that is Alex the parrot. And I don't know whether anyone's heard of him. He belongs to a researcher in America. And even for an African grey parrot, Alex was very, very advanced. And this is him during a study where he's selecting bricks according to their colour on cue. So the first hypothesis, putting all this together then, is to do with the mimicking of odor molecule frequencies. Birds have a very well-developed olfactory sense, and some songbirds, notably the blue tit and the European starling, actually line their nests with aromatic herbs like lavender. The curious thing about these herbs is that they have antimicrobial properties. So the theory behind this is that birds do this to reduce the parasite load in the nest, making it a healthy environment for the juveniles, and therefore it increases the survival chances of the juveniles. So the first hypothesis then is that songbirds produce the vibrational frequencies of volatile aromatics in their mating vocalizations, or song. The second hypothesis is to do with the frequency mimicking of EM frequencies. For this, I'm going into aposematism and mimicry. So aposematism is where animals display a color signal to show that they're dangerous, that they shouldn't be eaten. So for example, we have the social insects, they're known to sting, the bees and the wasps. This on the bottom is a poison dart frog, and to the right, that's a cinnabar moth caterpillar. So not palatable really to predators. This, however, is a hoverfly. It's not a bee or a wasp, it's only got one pair of wings, it's a dipteran, and it's completely harmless. It doesn't sting, it's not toxic, but it still shows this yellow and black coloration. So what do the yellow and black markings mean? Well, I treated the yellow and black pattern as an object, and then I tried to work out what the sign was. And it's not really clear. I don't know whether it's the colour pattern, the contrast between the colours, just the fact that those two colours are together in combination, or something else entirely. But what we can really be sure of is that the interpretation is that it means caution, be careful, avoid, there's a potential hazard here. This is not the same as this red emergency stop colour that we often see in nature and that we use. This is a yewberry. It contains a substance known as taxine. And I think the fatal dose in humans, adult humans, is only about 50 milligrams. So if a blue tit were to eat one, it's not going to survive. And so that seems to be kind of different from this caution, the yellow and black caution sign. And humans use this sign, it's everywhere in our hazard warnings, biohazard, other hazards, crime scene tape, and these bollards at the bottom, not hazardous in themselves, but you wouldn't want to back your car into them. So I started wondering if this cautionary sign meaning occurred anywhere else in nature. And I came across the Nightingale's Broadband trill. This is a song element, so you can see it starts where the red arrow is, and it's actually part of this bird's mating vocalizations. So it's not a short range call, which is indicating an imminent aggressive encounter. It's a long range vocalization. It's resonated out into the environment as part of the mating vocalizations. And it has the general meaning, this is my territory, don't come in, don't come any closer. So it seems to have a similar meaning to the yellow and black. And when you look further, going back to the cross-modal aspect of it, the great thing I find about spectrograms is that you can actually use them to see sound. And when you do that and you compare it to the yellow and black marking, it led me to ask the question as to whether the origins of the trill were cross-modal frequency mimicking of the yellow and black pattern, which means caution, so a referential descriptive vocalization. And certainly nightingales are not the only animals to use trills. This is a wren, for example, they trill. And also growling in mammals is another broadband frequency. This spectrogram at the bottom here it looks like a solid block, but actually if you stretch it out, it would look very much like a broadband trill. So the next hypothesis is that trills and growls are descriptors of the yellow and black cautionary pattern. So moving on from there, this is the third hypothesis, and this is to do with acoustic vocal mimicry. And to describe this, I'm going to use a very specific example, and that's starlings. Starlings form breeding pairs and they show biparental care, and they're renowned mimics. There are a lot of studies on starling mimicry, and there's no real consensus as to why they do it. There are various hypotheses, for example, that it's a social behavior, but nobody really knows. And just a bit of an anecdotal story. I have a friend who had a pair of starlings nesting in her garage, which happened to be joined onto her kitchen. And she had a dishwasher that played a tune when it had finished its program. And the starlings in her garage actually learned to mimic. They started mimicking the noise of the dishwasher. And so putting all this together, the next hypothesis is that acoustic mimicry actually allows referential vocalizations which describe sounds in the local environment, and that these might act as guides back to the breeding nest, so that while one parent is out foraging, the other one can guide it back whilst reducing predation risk, because obviously a predator, it might respond to birdsong, but it won't respond to the sound of a dishwasher, for example. So just to summarize then, in an overview of all this, the overarching research question is, could frequency mimicking be a basis for vocal communication and indeed the evolution of human language, as opposed to gestural origins or other alternative hypotheses? And the two main overarching hypotheses are that complex language developed from early hominid species and other ancestral animal species, mimicking frequencies that they've detected in the environment to communicate with other individuals. And that secondly, the underlying mechanism is based on a single mechanoreceptor process for sensory perception. And as I say, unfortunately, I don't have any data to present yet, but there are options for experimental studies. For example, there's a lot of data coming through, archaeological and forensic data from early hominids, suggesting that their communicative abilities were a lot more complex than originally thought. And this picture is taken from the Museum of Wales. They summarise some of the research going on, and they also have produced a soundscape that Neanderthal would have heard. But unfortunately, Neanderthal and other early hominids are no longer around, so we can't test them directly, but modern humans are. So not only is there the potential for laboratory-based studies, but we can study visual arts, literature, musicality and emotional expression, and there is the possibility for comparative studies with our close relatives, the great apes. But we can move on to experimental studies with non-human animals as well. There are some really great opportunities out there. The songbirds obviously produce these complex vocalizations, bird song. The little birds with the orange bill there in the left, they're zebra finches. They're often used in laboratory studies. We've got the cetaceans, the whales and the dolphins. They also produce song, very complex song. There are seals in the top corner. They're known to be vocal mimics as well. And of course, our own relatives, the great apes. So hopefully, well, if anybody's interested in reading any more, these are the papers, In Search of a Unified Theory of Sensory Perception. That was published in Biosemiotics. And I also went on to discuss and develop the idea a bit further in this paper, chemiosemiosis and complex pattern signals, a chemiosemiotic hypothesis of language evolution, and that was published in Linguistic Frontiers. So I'm hoping one day that I might have some evidence, I might be able to find out if songbirds are quite literally singing a rainbow. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, any questions or comments?
Hi, Amelia. First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk. I think it's always challenging to have a talk in the evening, and you managed the challenge. I have a question out of curiosity. When you could you go back to the slide where you show the quotient sign, all of which are yellow and black? I was wondering whether you have looked into the cultural implications are, for example, those signs in Japan of the same color? Or I was wondering whether those, whether you have looked into the cultural implications.
Yes, there are studies. I'm not an expert on the human cultural aspect really, but I did look into that when I wrote this paper. And as I say, this yellow and black seems to be relatively ubiquitous, and certainly with the effective colour associations, they are found to be cross-cultural. So yes, I think it needs separating out. There are elements where it's associative or whether it's a cultural origin, but there are definitely some spontaneous, just innate colour associations there. But this yellow and black seems to be one that is relatively ubiquitous. I'm afraid I can't, I'm not an expert on the human cultural aspect. But from what I could find out and from what I read, the yellow and black does seem to be cross-cultural.
Thank you.
Right, please raise your hands again, those who have questions. I have one for now then, in the meantime. Could you explain in simple terms how the frequencies in a bird song can mimic yellow and a pattern involving yellow and black? I mean, I see the stripes, right? When you indicate the frequencies in the bird song, but how do you see yellow in that, for instance?
This is what I'd really like to test, because the honest answer is I don't know. It was just the meaning seems to be the same of that trill and the yellow and black pattern. And when you compare them visually, they do look strikingly similar. So you get this alternating stripe, it looks like a stripe, and sort of acoustically, it sounds like this alternating, very fast oscillating frequency. So that's what I'd like to test really. It is purely perceptual. And I don't know, because I don't know what part of that yellow and black is actually the sign, it's really difficult to answer that at the moment. I don't know whether it's the stripy pattern or whether it's some kind of contrast between the frequency that would be yellow light and, well, I guess black, what would be no light, no frequency. And so I don't know whether, you know, if they can hear that and then try and reproduce it as we would try and describe someone like something like onomatopoeically. I don't know whether they would be able to reproduce that as kind of an alternating sequence, a way of describing a series of stripes.
Right, so it seems like the stripes or the pattern is the similarity rather than the exact color maybe. So
yeah, I think so. I mean, look, when you look at the patterns, they are all slightly different, but they are all this alternating yellow and black. Even when you look at the frog, it kind of has these bars, these stripes, and on the wasp, yeah, it's kind of got a triangular element and the dots, but it does, from a human point of view, human perception, when you look at them, it is the alternating yellow and black, but that's a very human perception. That's why it'd be really interesting to test it, because of course there's no way of knowing whether animals perceive it the same. But certainly I perceive that, and we talk of social insects as being yellow and black stripy. It's kind of when you think of a social insect, that's what you think, the stripy aspect.
Right, now Frederick has a question.
Yeah, that's more like a commentary. I recall in the early days, like 30 years ago, when I was on my way into semiotics, one of the very first papers I heard was by Thomas Semiotic. And he had been commissioned by the American authorities to investigate whether it was possible to make warning signs for nuclear waste that may be read by future human beings in a million years. And he answered, no, that was not possible. Now you say it's possible.
So do I think it's possible?
Yeah.
I didn't quite catch the question, sorry.
You know, Semiotic claimed that it was impossible to make warning signs for nuclear waste addressing human beings in a remote future. He said that could not be done. Now you say it can be done.
I did hear that he had thought that would be impossible. I don't know, because I suppose it's true that those signs weren't particularly around during the Victorian era, certainly in this country even. But then we didn't have, in the Victorian era, probably nobody would really have, I don't know, come across the poison dart. I don't know. That's why I'd like to test it, because even if you get data that doesn't support it, you can find out more about what that pattern means to animals. And certainly the fact that we've got Batesian mimics, it seems to have kind of almost decoupled. The yellow and black has become completely decoupled from its true meaning, because the hoverfly isn't dangerous at all. So it's become completely decoupled. It's just why that's happened, and whether animals have that capability to describe, because I suppose as well our language develops all the time. So I guess for animals it could be the same. We sort of assume that, oh well, a dog barks or whines or growls, and that's never going to change, but or unless they sort of go through an evolutionary process that changes in some way the vocal apparatus. But we kind of don't think of animal communications as being plastic, but I don't know. That's why I'd like to test it. It's a starting point.
There's one question or comment in the chat online. Jamila asks whether some of the patterns involving stripes and so on also involves tigers and zebras. I don't know whether you want to elaborate, Jamila. Otherwise, it's up for you to comment, Amelia.
Yes, and I know one of the theories behind those is they are cryptic, so they're involved in camouflage. And this is another thing that I'd really have to work on separating out, is the cryptic stripes. But the interesting thing about the cryptic stripes on, say, a zebra or a tiger is that they're not these straight bars. I mean, as I say, even in the little poison dart frog down there, they're kind of squiggly, but you still get these very straight bar, these stripes. And the same with the wasp. It's got the kind of triangular pattern on it as well, but it's still striped, it's still regular. They're kind of running parallel. Whereas the stripes on the tiger and zebra, they're not. They're a lot more fluid. They're not a regular stripy pattern. So that was actually another reason why I thought that this actual sign itself was the stripy pattern, the alternating yellow and black stripes. But that is an interesting point, and it's how animals, their vision works and they perceive it. Because a slightly tricky thing with testing this is that all animals have different visual capabilities. So for example, a dog doesn't see the color red. They don't have the full range of color vision that we do. So you'd have to look at aspects like that, the relationship that animal has to a sign in its environment, and how it's able to perceive those signs. So it's quite complex, which is probably why I'd start with the songbirds and maybe limit it down to one taxonomic group and the signs that it regularly perceives in its environment, because I'm guessing, for example, a blue tit has never come across a zebra or a tiger. So, but it does come across the social insect species quite regularly. So it's a complex one to plan, and I think you'd have to really narrow it down and do it each study one species by one species, and then maybe do a comparative study.
Right. Is there one last question or comment? Aline?
Thank you very much. I might be saying something that you probably already know, and I'm just being redundant. You know that Peirce had an intuition of the sorts. At some point, he was very critical. He just mentioned it in passing, but to make a bigger point, he was very critical about let's call it psychopedagogy at this time, in that he gave the example where some teachers, would laugh at the notion that a person blind from birth would say that the blare of a trumpet looks like this color scarlet, and he goes against the notion, saying that we wouldn't be surprised if actually there's even a similarity in the oscillation of sound with in the pair of a trumpet to this color scarlet. I don't remember exactly where this is. It might be in the syllabus. It's not really a question, just a comment in whether you came across this and where you find it insightful to go in versus scattered opinions on cross-modal similarities.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, in fact, the sound's not great. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to hear the sound on my computer, so sorry about that, but maybe the chat might be better. I can have a look in the chat afterwards.
Yeah, we'll do that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So now we move to Kalevi Küll, Professor of Biosemiotics at the Department of Semiotics, University of Tartu in Estonia. And he is also the an editor of Science System Studies, the journal, and a co-editor of 3 semiotic book series. Some related to biosemiotics, other more generally to semiotics. So please go ahead with your presentation, Biologies of Meaning, Kalevi. We cannot hear you yet.
It looks like we. No.
So, dear friends in semiotics, I envy all of you really who are there. You are there in Vilnius and can discuss semiotics later in this evening in the pub, but at least from distance now. So instead of semiotics, so is my slide moving?
Yes.
Good. Instead of semiotics, I'm going to speak about cryptosemiotics. Biosemiotics is nowadays a truly natural part of semiotics, but when looking to the role of, or rather the level of semiotics in contemporary biology, the picture is different. In other words, establishing semiotics as a natural basis for a large part of biology is still rather challenging task. So in this current study, my attempt is to sketch the main types of the concept of meaning as used in biology in the last century or more as we know it. This means not how semiotics was applied in biology, but how a kind of semiotics has emerged from biological studies themselves. This topic has not been systematically studied earlier as far as I can see. Anyhow, why such topic? Why it is interesting? Our understanding is that life is largely a semiotic phenomenon, and therefore a theory of life, theoretical biology, should obviously stand on semiotic basis. Now, introducing semiotics into biology, it is important to see how can it be linked to the existing theoretical apparatuses in biology. That means to look where the meaning is hidden in the main biological theories. So life is obviously an entity with the ability to meaning making, but in which form meaning exists in organisms and to which concepts in biology have been used to refer to meaning. So what I'm trying to do is, on the basis of some experience in biological studies and in theoretical biological thought, to find out and distinguish between the main existing approaches to the problem of meaning in biology. Thus, this work is not about semiotic theory, but about how biology itself has dealt with the problem of life's meaningfulness. So one may ask, what's my method? It's typology, conceptual empirical typology. In what extent heuristic or empirical typology you could decide. Or recalling a wonderful text, You Know My Method, by Thomas and Jean Sebeok, from Sebeok's most productive period 40 years ago. It is retroduction or guessing. Thus, we are going to describe how the condition of pre-linguistic meaningfulness has been dealt in biology without direct usage of semiotic conceptualization. In the biological thought, I could distinguish between 6 main approaches to meaning or meaning making. Of course, as always in taxonomies, in the living realm, there exist intermediate forms, there are exceptions, and also there can be additional divisions into types and subtypes. Thus, these 6 classes can be seen as the main research programs in biology. These differ by the way how meaning comes in, via which process it is introduced. So thus, meaning has been provided either by purpose, by survival, by code, by signaling, by prediction, or by Umwelt. Now, let us look briefly into each of these. Meaning from purpose. It's common in biology to connect function, purpose, and meaning. Something has meaning due to its purpose, which is due to its function. No function, no use, no meaning. Klaus Emmeke has a nice article, The Chicken and the Orphan Egg, on the function of meaning and the meaning of function, 2002, in which he writes, saying that cytochrome C means something to the cell is the same as saying that it has a function. So meaning appears here, among others, a mereological aspect of a system. A function is the function in relation to a whole. Organisms' features have also meaning as functional adaptations to environment or to other organs. This is a classical view of both of Lamarck and Darwin, later widely used in empirical biology. Again, meaning is function. In biology, functions are attributed to the traits, behavior, and parts of living things. I think things function can refer to its purpose, a benefit it confers on an organism, or the causal role it contributes to a more complex system capacity. When to see something's affordance, then this is to see how to use it, to see its function. Thus also the meaning from affordance would belong to this class. Introducing this function to something is very close to introducing a purpose or goal, an end. That means finality, that means teleology. Such teleological discourse using intermittently the terms function, meaning, and purpose works well, but only until one is not posing a question about its origin. And that question was, of course, raised, and teleology, the biologist mistress, about which Victoria Alexander wrote a nice book, was driven away. So, another program approach, we could call it meaning from survival. In the attempts to explicate and formalize and further quantify the concept of function, it was concluded that the most general function of organisms is to reproduce, just in order to survive. This led to the concept of reproductive success as the ultimate measure of everything an organism is doing, of all its behavior and structure, formalized and quantified as fitness. Here, something very interesting happened with meaning. Introducing the rate of reproduction as a universal measure, any hint of purpose would not be necessary anymore. This was understood as a solution for the teleology problem. However, what happened widely in biological discourse was that the reproductive success became the ultimate sign of meaningfulness. Also, organisms' features were said to have meaning as representing the fate of genes, or more precisely alleles, their reproductive success. This is all the genocentric or social biological or neo-Darwinian view. Meaning is the relation to fitness. During the period of hardening of modern synthesis, as Stephen Jay Gould has called it, some branches of the neo-Darwinian theory were introduced, like social biology, evolutionary psychology, behavioral ecology, and memetics. All these use productive success as the basis for meaning. In this model, which relates or reduces all behavior to the reproductive success, there appears an illusory need to survive. The need to survive became a dominant notion in biological discourse of the second half of the 20th century. It's rather interesting to observe that this meaning in relation to survival is purely anthropomorphic. Looking closely, it is easy to see that there is no such general need to survive in other species. Organisms have many needs, but these are all more particular, like for food, for warmth, for partner. As far as organisms do not have a concept of their own death, they cannot have a concept of survival, while they can have a concept of food, for instance. Thus, with such neo-Darwinian model, meaning turned to be plain and marginalized and truly illusionary. Though at the midst of neo-Darwinian era, another biological home for meaning concept was created. Meaning from code. Meaning is a correspondence based on codes, according to this approach. So Erwin Schrödinger was among the first who used the term code for the genetic process in 1944. Georgy Gamov in 1954 saw that the code concept could be applied to the inner working of biological cells, as he started to use the term translation for protein synthesis. It took another decade until the genetic code, the particular correspondence between the structures of gene and protein, was described, and even more, until the process of protein synthesis based on the sequential pattern of RNA was discovered. Anyhow, it was accepted that the meaning of a gene, a sequence of DNA, is a protein produced on its basis. Meaning of the triplet or codon, like maybe UGC, is a cysteine, amino acid cysteine, UGA and UAG is stop, means stop, and so on. Code is commonly defined as an arbitrary mapping, and so the genetic code, that's mapping or translation. In order to persist, mapping should have a mediator that functions as the mapping master, a map master. That means building or constructing the mapping, and genetic code really has it, the mediator, the set of transport RNAs. Code was also seen as a program, the genetic program. So genotype has a meaning for coding or representing or mapping for phenotype, the form of organism. Analogously, coding works for memory, and not only genetic, but there are also immunological and neural memory. Further on, specific codings work for instincts and for habits. And learning could be the process that is creating all these various codes. The code discourse all day leads to the computer metaphorics, in which what to call meaning looks rather arbitrary. The concept of code, of course, took its origin from the studies of communication. And that's now another field what has dealt with meaning in some extent in classical biology. What's communicated obviously has some meanings. Signal is about something thus meaningful. Biological literature about animal communication and further intercellular communication is rather extensive. However, what is remarkably interesting to see is that the aspect of interpretation has received very little attention in this literature. Biological communication studies are mainly about the chemical or other nature of carriers, about the communication channels, about the ethic, and almost not about the emic aspect of communication. With communication and learning, though, another type of meaning arises.
Couple of minutes.
Meaning from prediction. Habit, what is acquired by learning, represents certain regularity or rhythmicity around. As much as this regularity persists, the habit has a feature of prediction, the meaning of prediction. And also other way around, meaning of something equals the anticipation of what one could do with it. If using the concept of feed forward in behavioral studies, it refers to the expected or desired future. Nevertheless, anticipation is mainly used in the context of cybernetic models, which speak of meaning without assuming a subjective world. Though there is also a biological concept that relates meaning to subjective space, meaning from Umwelt. Meaning is a feature of organisms Umwelten. This is Küll's view. Meaning is the result of personal interpretation. Meaning is interpretant, which presupposes difference. Fundamental feature of Umwelt is co-presence, co-localization, that is simultaneity of something. The absolutely minimal Umwelt consists of difference. Difference, in order to be a difference, required at least two receptors to register incompatibility. This cannot be without simultaneity, which means of subjective time. It makes the concept of meaning in the framework of Umwelt quite rich. That Umwelt is related to simultaneity, Gestalt, and choice was demonstrated in the works of Victor von Weizsäcker. If there is no Umwelt, there is no sign or semiosis. If there is no semiosis, there is no meaning. Here, a very interesting question arises. So what is the nature of linkage between science and Umwelt in the subjective space? Can science be linked otherwise than in Umwelt? Anyhow, assuming that meaning should be a relation, and presuming the minimal models of purpose, survival, code, signaling, prediction, and Umwelt, we can see that in almost all these relations of purpose, of reproduction success, of code, of communication, of anticipation, the relata can be separated in time, one after the other. In purpose, this after that, well, survival, current generation and next generation, code, original and copy, signaling sender and the receiver, prediction, there is today and tomorrow, except in case of Umwelt, since the space requires simultaneity. That means the first five can be described all diachronically, say in description of Umwelt, at least in some extent, synchronicity has to be kept, otherwise it's not Umwelt anymore. Minimal Umwelt is just a difference, while difference of something simultaneous. If the relata are separated in time, the relationship can have a causal explanation. Only for Umwelt, such explanation is impossible. But for a model of semiosis, the irreducibility and, in that sense, non-causal relation is necessary. Thus, the concepts of meaning, as these exist in traditional biology, are in most part rather poor. These do not include sufficient conditions for real meaning making, for semiosis, in order to make the semiotic model necessary. Instead, these can be explained by physicalist models. An exception is Umwelt. In the Umwelt, co-presence of relata is irreducible. So, once again, if relata are separated in time, the relationship can have a causal explanation. For Umwelt, such explanation is impossible because its relata is simultaneous. The concept of meaning, as it exists in the traditional biology, is poor. It does not include sufficient conditions for making the semiotic model necessary. Therefore, like physicalist, the physicalist models can prevail in those parts of biology, or those programs, study programs. So an exception is Umwelt, co-presence in its relata is irreducible. Conclusion. The only reliable existing biological model that is irreducible to causal modeling is Umwelt. Therefore, it is the best existing model for further building of semiotic biology. Thank you.
Okay, who has questions or comments? And Alin, please let me know if there are people online. Yeah. Right, Oscar.
Hello, Kalevi, this is Oscar Miyamoto. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you could tell us something in your imagination. Have you ever thought of what could have come if PERS and XII could have worked together? Or a crossover between PERS and XII, imagine them collaborating in a paper or something. Can you tell us something about this? Umweltian phaneroscopy.
Well, one should write a novel about this, but I think their way of thinking was rather different. You should say that XII was not interested in mathematics. Seemingly PERS was not so interested in earthworms. So that's but yeah, that's yeah, for novelists to discuss.
I suppose quite a few biosemiotics are trying to make a synthesis out of those two works, even though it would, of course, be different if the two men were going to do it themselves.
Yeah, true. Of course, I think it's as I see now here. We should pay attention very much where is irreducibility situated. And that irreducibility, say, in what sense semiosis for Peirce is irreducible, the triad is irreducible. And as I can see, the way to understand it is to accept that representation object and interpretant are simultaneous. So in that case, they cannot have this usual causal model. Now in the same way for Umwelt, say, to take it as in, well, the concept of Umwelt is used in different ways, so you can also expand it in time. So, but it has at least, it cannot exist without this aspect of simultaneity in some aspect, some part at least. So here we should put these two together, and then we can go.
Are there other questions? Otherwise, I'll try. So your assertion here that within an Umwelt framework, there are limits to how much we can use causal explanations. If I got you right, you said that, well, would you say that incidents in an Umwelt or among creatures within Umwelt cannot be explained causally because the relata are simultaneous? But I would like to challenge you on that point, and also with regard to what you just said now, that we can also conceive of the Umwelt as extended in time, such as Küll's notion of an Umwelt tunnel that one animal goes through. So the Umwelt is not only momentary, it also fills the whole lifespan. And we could also talk about sequences of organisms and Umwelten. So is it then not possible to explain Umwelt phenomena in causal terms? And if it's not possible in the traditional way, what about semiotic causation, Hofmeier's notion?
So, of course, this temporal dimension exists there, and so it is just naturally possible to add this causal dimension, but that is, yeah, additional dimension, say, to that, yeah, simultaneous space. Subjective space, which is just yeah, a necessary core, let's say, of Umwelt. Likewise, of course, you can have a whole sequence of semiosis. So you can extend events of semiosis in time. Then similarly, causality appears there, but say event of semiosis itself, say, is including that irreducible simultaneity. Both, that's just analogously for semiosis and Umwelt here. And putting these together, of course, is very, well, rich, I think, because then the sign, it occurs, cannot be outside of Umwelt. And
that's the rejection of physiosemiosis.
Yeah. Okay. So at first approximation, yes, but of course then it's the whole story how physiosemiotics should be interpreted. It's already other. But yes.
Any other questions or comments? If not, thank you very much,
Thank
Kalevi.
you. Thank you very much.
And now I'll change my hat and present myself, the last talk in this session. Can you stop? No, you're not showing your screen anymore, right? So I'll just get my presentation up and I'll have a very brief presentation of myself. My name is Morten Tønnessen and I'm a professor of philosophy, as you see, in Stavanger, Norway. And I am Norwegian born, Estonian educated, with PhD from Estonia, and Brazilian married. And topic of my talk is neurosemiotics across species. And the presentation is based on excerpt from a book chapter that is forthcoming with the same name that will appear in a Routledge handbook of neurosemiotics. So a handbook on neurosemiotics is around the corner, and this is one of maybe 3 chapters, if I remember correctly, with a biosemiotic framing one way or another. And I would like to mention one of my affiliations that is especially relevant for this topic, and that's the Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience Lab at the University of Stavanger, which is being established. And I happen to be the chair of the steering group of this cognitive lab. But the lab, of course, will facilitate experimental work, and the paper I'm presenting today is rather groundwork, theoretically. And here you see a couple of my colleagues illustrating cognitive research. So my background and also my framing for this talk on neurosemiotics is that I'm coming from biosemiotics and have worked quite a bit with Umwelt theory. So I will have that approach and that focus when I now discuss neurosemiotics. So that's a field related to neural phenomena or aspects of what we might call cognitive science. And what I'm exploring in this paper is what we can say generally about neurosemiotics that is valid across species for all sentient animals, any organism with a nervous system. And one of the reasons why I think this is relevant is because it's an opportunity to say something about how neurosemiotic perspectives are important within the Umwelt theory, even though Jakob von Uexküll worked at a time where natural science had not done as much work on cognition and the modern kind of work that is being done on studying brain function and the nervous system and so on. But it remains a fact that in order to understand the Umwelt of sentient organisms, we need to understand neurosemiotic aspects of their experience and behavior. And I'll also try to show how this is, some of these core ideas are central in Uexküll's work as well. We could start out with asking, what are nerves for? Why do we need them, and what do we use them for? And it might be good to ask a fundamental question about this, because perception and cognition is in one sense so obvious to us as perceptive, conscious, self-reflective beings. But this is a quote from Jesper Hofmeyr, where he says very briefly and succinctly what nerve cells are about and what change they made in the evolution of life. He writes, movement, as animals operate with, demands that muscle cells at one corner of the organism instantaneously, that is in microseconds, coordinate their activity with muscle cells at the other end. And to achieve this coordination from the perspective of a single cell, long distance communication within the organism became the very art of nerve cells. So the nervous system, of course, is related both to the perceptual faculties of an organism, but also to the effective or operational faculties. So it's, of course, some kind of mediator between what we perceive and how we act, largely through our muscles. And now I'll say a little bit about Küll and his work in this context. First of all, we can note that he wrote several articles on what was in his time in German called Nerven- und Muskelphysiologie. Yeah. They cannot see the slides. Okay, sorry. So suppose I have to do that from here. Is it appearing now?
Yes.
Should I go back?
No, you should see. Yeah, this is good.
Now it's showing. Okay. So I got this far. So especially in the period 1892 to 1915, Küll wrote another number of articles on topics related to what we now can call neurosemiotics. And it's an important biographical fact that what we can call his neurosemiotic outlook, or these kind of topics, is what convinced him that Umwelt theory could be of wider interest and that he could have something to say about biology more generally and not just about specific species that he had studied. So he made some realizations during this early work, which convinced him that Umwelt theory was needed and something he could develop. And we see in the Umwelt theory that Küll emphasizes the central role of the central nervous system for the constitution of the Umwelt. And that's easy to recognize also in depictions of the functional cycle. And in the main scientific biological work of Küll, Theoretische Biologie, he also mentioned related topics very early on, one of the first few pages, as he is starting and presenting the whole book. And he writes programmatically, the task of biology consists in expanding the lessons of Kant's research in two directions. One, to take into account the role of our bodies, particularly our sense organs and our central nervous system. And two, to study other subjects, the animals' relations to objects. And these 2 points are, of course, related as well, since object perception by sentient animals is mediated through the nervous system. So this is really at the core of the Umwelt theory, at least insofar as the Umwelt theory is about sentient animals with a nervous system. And I'll discuss the notion of neural codes. That was not a term at Küll's time, as far as I know. But I think we can relate those in hindsight also to the workings of organisms with a nervous system within an Umwelt framing. And they could, in that case, be taken to relate to the integration and interaction between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. And the Innenwelt is Küll's term for the inner subjective world, which in a way mirrors the Umwelt, the outer subjective world. So it relates also to the animal's distinction between what is inside it and its body and what is outside, what is the environment surrounding it. There are, in addition to recognizing that the Innenwelt is a neurosemiotic construct, addressing how the nervous system works, we can also acknowledge that other central coinages by Küll, such as the Merkwelt and the Wirkwelt, are also really neurosemiotic constructs. So many of his core terms are relevant in the context of neurosemiotics. And the Merkwelt has to do with our use of our senses, and the Wirkwelt has to do with the use of our muscles. And this all goes through the nervous system. Now I'll ask some questions about the neural code and how it relates to semiotics. And there are some discussions ongoing that are informative, that also show that there is disagreement between different semioticians with regard to whether or not we can regard the neural code as a proper semiotic code at all. And there's also disagreement more widely as well, whether the code metaphor in this context is useful, whether it's informative, whether it says anything we can test or study closely. And it's also related to another fundamental question concerning whether mental representations exist. And here as well, there are different schools, with some saying that there are representations, others that we can explain cognitive and neural processes and phenomena without making any assumption about representations. First, here's a definition of the neural code. And that term is sometimes used in singular and sometimes in plural. Here it says in an encyclopedia definition that the neural code can be characterized as something that triggers a signal that carries an abstract representation of some signal or process of interest. And that neural coding is being conducted in neurons that act as information processing channels that take incoming information, integrate it, and produce a signal that contains information encoded in the neural electrical activity. So in this view, neural codes and neural coding is related to encoding and decoding of signals. And there's a lot of semiotic terms here. So of course, one way to relate to this is to say that this is obviously semiotic. But as I said, there's considerable disagreement about how this can be understood. In a quite recent Target article, the neuroscientist Romain Brett argues that neural codes is not a useful metaphor. And he says that what we refer to as neural codes are unstructured and therefore unable to represent relations. And he says that the neural coding metaphor cannot provide a valid basis for theories of brain function because it is incompatible with both the causal structure of the brain and the representational requirements of cognition. So he does not deny that there are some kind of inner representations related to cognition, but he says that the neural code doesn't explain or fit with such a view. And one response to this paper is written by the biosemioticians Terence Deacon and Joanna Rasasek-Leonardi. And they claim that the coding metaphor has become more problematic than helpful. So they want to use other language rather than referring to a neural code. But at the same time, they do not want to abandon the concept of representation altogether. So they want to reconstruct what kind of representation we can refer to in relation to neural processes. And they build on person semiotics combined with systems dynamics and try to develop an alternative view where they think it makes sense to refer to neural representations, but stress that these representations must be understood as dynamical and given a conventional understanding of codes as fixed. This rules out a conception of a neural code. So they say that term is out of place. It doesn't help understanding these phenomena. Marcello Barbieri, the code biologist, takes a different view. He regards the neural code as one of several central important organic codes and thinks that code biology can provide a framework for understanding neural codes. And he admits that the neural code involves an unknown mechanism. And that's some people's criticism as well, that by referring to a neural code, you name it, but there's a lot that is misunderstood regarding what mechanism is really at work in the nervous system. But in Barbieri's view, neural codes made conscious life as well as feelings possible. And he distinguished between simpler and more complex animals, saying that the simpler ones have pretty much hardwired behavior. And in those cases, the neural code would, to a large extent, determine perception and action, whereas more complex animals also operate with neural codes, but have interpretive skills, which makes things more complex. There's also this ambiguity related to whether we refer to one universal neural code, which Barbieri does as well, or in the plural form, that there are different specific neural codes that are typical for different sense organs or histomological tissues or physiologies. My own view is, in a way, a middle path between these two that I've presented now, the Persians and the code biologist. I think that it could make sense to maintain a terminology of codes in this context, but it would need to be reconceptualized. So I distinguish between fixed codes, which mostly compares to what Barbieri often refers to, and flexible codes, such as, for instance, ecological codes. And there's other authors as well, including Kalevi and Timo Maran, who has promoted similar ideas that some codes should be regarded as more flexible, especially in an ecological setting. And I think we need to understand neural codes in context with ecological context as well, to understand how cognitively complex animals perceive and act. I think this kind of, the different notions of codes, with some, like the neural code, being fixed, and others, like ecological codes, being more flexible and fluid, is necessary to understand complex animal behavior. And I think one way to integrate some of these modern themes with umwelt theory is to focus on how specific organisms and species are constrained by their specific physiology, which defines the possible scope of their subjective experience. So even with a universal, in one sense, neural code at bottom that is involved in the translation from sensory stimuli to perceptual images and so on, we can understand this related to how organisms differ in their ecological context and in their exact physiology and in their life experience, which further configures the animal's sensitivity to different phenomena and their inclinations behaviorally and so on. So in this way, I think that we can say that the neural code or neural codes is utilized by animals in ways that make sense for the animal and that leads to diverse and context-dependent behaviors. And now I should wrap it up. And maybe I could just stop here. Yeah. All right, please let me know again if there's someone online. Yeah.
No, not so far.
I could go on a bit if there's no questions.
Can we go back to the slide where you define
Where I define
neural code?
the neural code.
Yes.
Here. So at the beginning, you see that there's one signal that really is representing a former signal. So that would be starting really with sensory stimuli that triggers spikes in the electric activity of neurons, which could be interpreted as a signal representing the initial sensory stimuli, and which is eventually communicated to the brain and triggers maybe a mental representation. So that's like a classical view, but that is under criticism by some.
In that sense, thanks for the clarification. My question would be, in what way this type of approach tells something about the what we call methodological, so this first person experience, so to speak, and actively express it in other needs. Because as code users, so to speak, we're not aware of this fully, but nonetheless we can have many representations. So yeah, sure. What about this other phenomenological teaching of experience, that is firstness, and the relationship with this?
So you talk about phenomenological code.
Yeah, like
What do you mean by that?
The counterpart of this would be the experience as such.
Sure, but part of this understanding could also imply that, I mean, it's supposed to explain how sensory stimuli can lead to experience, right? So that would be the end point in a way. And so one question, of course, is whether this happens automatically and how we can understand organisms as interpretative if there are some automated processes. But the claim really, if you say that there is a neural code, is that there's some kind of automated or fixed process that makes one signal trigger another one in a maybe automated fashion. But of course, we know that perception is not all about sensation. It's not all about the constant bombardment of sensory signals, but perception, especially in complex animals, has an agenda. It's selective, and it relates also to maybe the immediate needs or attention of the animal. So perception, of course, is edited, so to speak, and not simply an automated mirroring of all the sensory signals. So, but I think what makes sense is to say that the sensory input that is possibly experienced is partly mediated in a pretty much automated fashion. And then maybe the higher faculties minds are at work at the end point, so that sensation is not the end of the story. It's only the physiological basis of experience in a way.
That sounds very compatible with Seneca's view of medium angular causation, right? The notion that final causation or thermodynamics functionality can influence the material and efficient process facilitating that process, and the other way around, material basis of perception determine or constrain the higher process.
Sure.
And that's my question, is just something that was having to do.
Yeah, and I also think that maybe the more complex an animal is, the more it is driven by its experience of its own needs. And also in the case of human beings, which are self-reflective, I mean, we can maybe be extremely focused on something and extremely ignorant of other things that we could have experienced if we only paid attention to it, right? So, but I think that what drives our attention is more about interpretation and interpretive skills, whereas some of the biological foundation is more automated. And that's why I also think it makes sense to, might make sense to apply this notion of neural codes as part of a bigger whole. One question is whether there are animals that are sentient, but without making use of interpretation at all. And it's interesting that Jesper Hofmeier mentioned in one, discussed in one article whether snakes actually made use of interpretation, or whether they were more hardwired really in terms of how they perceive and how they act. And he indicates in that paper that he thinks maybe snakes do like an automated coupling between stimuli and action response without any interpretation in between. And I'm not entirely convinced he's right about that, but at least it raises the question whether we have to distinguish between the neurosemiotic agency of different groups of animals, where of course some are more advanced than others in terms of at least reflexivity and use of interpretative skills.
Sorry, there's a question online by one in the
Yeah.
This question.
Should I stop sharing maybe?
Thank you. Did you hear me, Martin?
We can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Martin, for this inspiring talk. I am really looking forward for the book about neurosemiotics. I think you have very good research questions, mainly in relation with the status of mental representations and this. I think they are very good questions. My question now is in relation with, is a kind of a follow-up question with the previous one, because sadly the time run out and you cannot elaborate about agency, and part of the abstract talk. The abstract says that you are going to talk, or what you were going to talk about agency. So I just want to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more how this is related with agency and the notion of agency that you are working on for this approach.
Yes. So it's true that I didn't get to cover as much as, well, the full paper and as much as indicated in the abstract. But I do think, I mean, if I had more time, I would go on to talk about how what I've said so far is related to the semiotic agency of organisms or also sentient animals of different complexity. And I think an important part of that is to discuss how neurosemiotic capacities is related to organisms' capacity to relate to objects. And there's a connection here with the more complex animals being related to more complex forms of objecthood, or to relate in more complex ways to objecthood. And there's probably some distinctions, some thresholds as well, as I tried to indicate with this snake example. At least that's Hofmeier's view, that, I mean, there are some thresholds where we can say that sufficiently complex, cognitively complex animals are able to relate to objects as cohesive, unified wholes, whereas some simpler organisms probably are not. And the question is where to draw the line, really. And that's an important empirical question, really, I think. And then there are several thresholds, so probably not just one, but I think a distinction that it makes sense to draw is between these kind of proper objects and proper subjects that are able to relate to this kind of objecthood. And so they have a high degree of subjectivity and an advanced semiotic agency in this context, whereas some simpler organisms have simpler capacities. So this is also related to the discussion of Tommy Vekavara and Alexei Sharo, for instance, about where to draw the line between genuine semiosis, eusemiosis, and protosemiosis in their terminology. I think we're out of time now. So let's finish here. And I close the session, and now I wonder whether Alin has something to say about what happens next. But thank you all for coming to this session.